So hello everybody, welcome to episode 29 of PHP Town Hall. There's a few of us in here today, joined by Ben Edmonds, of course, and myself, Phil Sturgeon. We've got Paul Jones and Daniel Lowrey. Did I get that right? There's one name per episode that I fuck up on, so that's it's fun. So how are you guys? What have you been up to today?
Reading internals.
I've spent a large amount of the last week reading internals. It's
a real time sink.
Sounds like a horrible time.
Oh, no, it's a good exercise in patience.
It's times like this that I'm glad I have unsubscribed from that stuff.
I actually can unsubscribe. I can, because I had such a hard time getting subscribed in the first place. It wouldn't take my email address. That I got like hard coded in. Someone on the team just rammed my email in the code or something. So now I've unsubscribed 5 times, and I still get every single email as it comes. I can't even switch to digest. So,
think on your sin.
I understand. I had just as much trouble getting subscribed. It's kind of the user interface. It's difficult. I can get the digest, but I can't get the full subscription. I didn't know that.
Every now and then someone says, hey, we should get a forum, we should use PHPPP, we should use digest, we should use any the fuck thing that's not this random thing, but I guess we're stuck with that for a while. It's probably for the best. If it was easy to comment on there as it was to comment on GitHub, then there would be even more assholes and internals, and it would be a much worse situation. There's an asshole right now. Moving on. The first thing that I want to talk about today, I guess, Paul, there's a lot of people that were asking us over the last few episodes about...
Should we do an intro? Should we do that?
We did an intro, didn't we?
Maybe you did before I came in.
Oh, I don't know what's happening. I was just very quickly steering away from me insulting internals once more. So yeah, we probably should do a little intro. Paul, do you want to just give us a little quick run through of who you are and what you do and why?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Paul Jones. I bill myself as an internationally recognized PHP expert. All I mean by that is when I travel internationally, I'm recognized by people who know PHP. I've been everything from a junior developer to a VP of engineering in all sorts of different organizations. In a previous career, I got paid to be a spy. I worked in the US Air Force doing what's called operations intelligence for 8 years. But since then, starting about '99, I've been doing PHP full-time. I wrote a book called Modernizing Legacy Applications in PHP that helps you with step-by-step instructions get your page-based, include-oriented spaghetti mess of a PHP application up to modern standards, so that by the end of the process you have a code base that is auto-loaded, dependency-injected, unit-tested, layer-separated, and front-controlled. I'm the lead on the Aura project. I've done a series of benchmarking, or a series of benchmarks about that relate to framework overhead, so that you know what the maximum responsiveness of any particular framework is when it's operating in a dynamic mode. I wrote some of the questions for the Zen certification exam, I think it was the 5.3 version. I don't remember now. I'm a voting member on the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, much to Phil's chagrin, I'm sure. Tons of other stuff, and the thing that I always like to end with is that I enjoy putting 7.62 millimeter holes in pieces of paper at 400 meters. So nice. That's my background.
That is the best part of that. And of course, for everyone that's a regular listener, Paul has been on the show once before, not twice. It was just the one time before, I believe.
Well, once that was published and once that got corrupted. Pending.
Yeah, that was back when we used TinyChat. TinyChat was great fun when it was just a bunch of us drunkenly, randomly chatting away, but it wasn't very good when we wanted to try and rip audio quality out of there. So, right. Yeah, there were like 10 of us, 10 top awesome people on the podcast, and I had to tell everyone, yeah, that didn't work out. We had like Anthony, Ferreira, and Taylor, and yourself, and a bunch of people, and I was like, yeah, we just wasted all of our times. So now we use Google Plus, which is obviously perfect and without any sort of fault.
And the nice thing is that the NSA keeps a backup for us.
Exactly. So Daniel, your turn. Who are you and what do you do?
Well, I studied economics in school and worked as a stockbroker when I got out of school, and decided it was soul crushing. I really wasn't into it, and so I left so I could program all day, and that was about 10 years ago. I started off writing financial things in Python, and wanted to do web stuff, so I started doing PHP because I didn't really know anything about it at the time, and been doing it ever since then. A couple of years ago, started getting into C and started contributing to internals. 5.6 is the first thing I've really submitted anything useful for, and it's any of the encryption, TLS, SSL stuff that you do. The 5.6 version, I probably had my hands on, so hopefully some of the NSA stuff is mitigated. It'll be easier to avoid some of those things, and I also like putting holes in things, but I'm not nearly as accurate as some from 40 yards. So I have my concealed carry permit.
Oh,
Right
nice.
on, brother.
Guns.
And right now, Phil is just biting his tongue.
No, I love guns. I've been shooting a bunch of times. They're great fun. I don't think they let British people get them quite as easily as Americans, though. I mean, I'm barely allowed to have a fucking $200 credit card right now. I've finally got one after being here for a year. They've let me have a credit card that has $200 on it, and I had to give them $50 for that pleasure. So if I start trying to get a fucking handgun, then I think they're going to be a little bit less likely to go ahead.
The last time
Yeah.
we saw British with guns in this country, it didn't go so well. So
I think it went pretty well for you, to be honest.
well, yeah, it didn't go so well for the British. Yeah.
Yeah. I felt sorry for my girlfriend. She was over in England during July 4th, and there was another American that was saying, "So, do the British support? Do they celebrate Independence Day like we do?" And I was like, obviously, I could just call this guy an asshole, but that would be far too easy. So I just explained that every year we get together and have a massive celebration to really rejoice in the day that we finally got rid of you whining little bastards.
Mm-hmm.
There's sending us letters all the time, complaining about stuff, not paying your taxes, ditching our tea. We finally just went, you know what, we're done with you guys, you can have it. And then we just celebrate getting you off our shoulders. And he was like, whoa, really? And no. Dumbass. Anyway. So Ben, are we introed now? Is that?
That's acceptable. Yes.
Cool. Next. So yeah, one of the first things we actually had you on by request, Paul, to talk about your action domain responder. Yes, action domain responder is a slight alternative or replacement to MVC. Would you like to give a little rundown on that?
Sure. So Nate Obley is the one who says it probably ought to be a replacement for Model View Controller. I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not really willing to go with it being a full replacement right now. The long version of it is this. When I was writing the book on modernizing legacy applications, of course the idea is to tease apart the different concerns in these horrible spaghetti messes of code. You start with some foundational stuff, but eventually you get to the point where you need to separate out the model work. So you pull out a bunch of SQL into gateways, and you pull out the actual model work into transaction scripts or a service layer. Then because it's model view controller, that's the way we think about separating all of our stuff. After the model, of course, you do the views. You've got this page script with a bunch of object setup work and a bunch of what eventually is going to be controller work, but it's all mixed in with a bunch of presentation work as well. So the first time I wrote the chapter, I wrote it using templates, because when we think about a view in PHP, we think about a template system generally, whether it's Twig or something that's descended from Savant, whether it's Zen Framework, the Zen View or a View or something like that, where you have essentially the generation of the HTML or the generation of whatever the presentation is going to be, sitting off in a different file or in a template file, something like that, and then you invoke the template file from your controller and inject that into the response somehow. So the first few times I worked through that in writing that chapter in the book, templates worked out fine, but then I started realizing that there are times when the controller ends up setting headers. And again, these are page scripts, so we don't think about them as a controller per se, but the problem is still the same. If you've got a template that renders, say, XML or renders JSON, or it needs to set a status header of some sort, or it needs to send a content type header of some sort. What we typically do is in the controller, we hand off to the template. The template builds the body of the HTTP response. Then it comes back to the controller, and the controller sets the necessary headers. Again, whether that's a status code, maybe setting a cookie, something like that. And I realized that because I knew where the book was going, I knew we were going to end up in a standardized way of invoking our controllers, that the response always had to come back in exactly the same way, that there was really no reasonable place to put the header setting work. And in that, because it clearly doesn't go in the model, well, and the templates don't really handle header setting. They don't handle cookies or anything like that. They just handle, essentially the body portion of the HTTP response. So I realized in doing that and thinking about it that model view controller, when you're talking about model view controller, the view is actually a little bit more than just the template system. The view that is presented to the client when it makes a request from the server is the HTTP response. That means it's not just the body of the response, it's also the headers that go along with that response. So that was sort of the first step leading me towards the idea of action domain responder. And in the book, I just say, your controllers need to inject stuff directly into the response. In the book, the idea is there's a response object that also handles templates, and it buffers header and set cookie calls and set raw cookie calls, that kind of thing, so that you can test the response that's coming out of the controller. But afterwards, I realized that the model view controller pattern actually realized is maybe not the right word. I went back and did the research, and there are lots of good presentations from PHP guys, like the guys from Quafu. I think it's Stefan Priebsch who does one about the origins of model view controller. That MVC actually originates from a very long time ago. A guy named Trygve Rinskaug, and I'm sure I am just butchering the guy's name, came up with the model view controller pattern for Smalltalk 80. To work in desktop applications. And in that original description of the pattern, each element on the screen, and again it's a desktop application pattern, each element on the screen has its own trio of model view controller working together to present that as a user interface pattern on the screen. So if you've got a username input field, it's got its own model view and controller on the back end in the desktop app. If you additionally have a button, the button has a model view and controller associated with it. So the reason and in addition to that, the model and the view, once they've been tied together by the controller, the model and the view are allowed to talk to each other. So the view updates the model, and the model sends data back to the view without necessarily going back through the controller. So that's the formal description of model view controller. And a lot of people who have been doing MVC on the web realized this a long time before I did and have complained about MVC being only an imperfect fit on the web. And even with that in mind, even it being an imperfect fit, it's been the best thing that we've had because we still need to separate these concerns. But the thing that led me to Action Domain Responder looking at that was that, first of all, we think in terms of web-side or server-side web interactions, that having the view and the model talk to each other is probably bad form. We don't want our views talking directly to our models and issuing SQL calls. So that sort of breaks part of the formal model view controller process. And in addition to that, because we think of the views in model view controller as being the template only, and then putting things like header setting in the controllers, that sort of breaks that separation of the presentation layer. If the thing that is presented to the client is the response, then there ought to be a completely separate layer that deals with building the response. So again, after going through the modernizing legacy stuff and doing that research and figuring out what the actual presentation layer ought to be, it seemed to me that we need to think of the view not as the template, but as what I call a responder. That is the thing that builds the response, so that the controller hands off, once it gets its data from the model, hands that off not to a template, but hands it off to what I'm calling a responder, and it sets the headers, and it sets the cookies, and it gets the template to set the body and the response. So that's really the core of the revelation for me, was that. It turns out people are doing that kind of thing anyway. They just hadn't really talked about it before.
It's pretty much, I very much agree, and I think most people do, that MVC, there's kind of two problems with it. The first problem that we've known for a long time is that what we were calling MVC, and the PHP in general, like Ruby and world, wasn't really MVC. It's kind of the old-fashioned small talk thing, and we went, that sounds about right, we'll do that. And
Exactly.
I think you're very much right that the other problem is that it's kind of evolved badly. I'm looking through a lot of your blog posts about it, especially one about content negotiation. The larger problem seems to be that these days, as PHP developers are spending more and more time making APIs and less time doing basic fucking crud apps and validating and responding, the MVC fits less and less and less, because it used to very much be you've got your controller, you collect your post arguments, you send off a big array, that goes into your model, and then you just dump out some crap in a HTML form. But as soon as you have to start thinking about content negotiation, I am going to output this XML and JSON and HTML and all of that shit, you've suddenly got this, like, you've either got a really, really heavy controller that's doing 25 different things, or you've got some other layer of stuff. So it doesn't work there at all, because you've either ruined the controller, or you've basically you're adding more layers on top. So for me, I've not been doing MVC. I've been doing, like, I have MVC, and they have domain objects, and then there's also transformers that make my JSON look pretty, and then there's like these other 25 different layers. So I think we are at a point where we need to kind of expand beyond the classical definition of MVC, because we're not even actually using the classical definition properly.
Again, I agree. I think that so one of the things that we say about patterns is that they are a vocabulary to describe things we're already doing. They're not proscriptive, they're descriptive. Or not, they're prescriptive, they're descriptive. So the fact that people are already doing this kind of thing leads me to believe that the pattern's already validated, that it's already being used, and we just haven't had a phrase to describe it yet. And then you talk about the controllers doing multiple, lots of different things. The natural follow-on from having a responder handle all your response building stuff for you and getting all that out of the controller means that if you've got a controller, let's just say it's a simple controller, your basic thing with your browse, read, edit, update, delete, or index, create, read, update, delete, say it's a blog controller, something like that. It turns out that if you've got those 5 different methods, those 5 different methods are not necessarily going to be using or sending the same kinds of headers and cookies, whatever. For example, your read action in a controller might only send a 200 or a 404. That is, I found it or I didn't find it. But your update action might send back a whole series of different things. It might send back a 302 or a 303 if the creation or if the update occurred properly, and then it's doing a post after get. It might send back a 422 if the data that you submitted was properly formed, but it actually turns out to be invalid in terms of the application domain. The delete is going to send back a different set of stuff. So it turns out that if you've got a controller with 5 different methods or 5 different actions in it, you need a different responder for each one. This is actually a very natural thing. We've already got a different template for each of those methods probably, so having a different responder class for each one also makes sense. The problem with that is that if you've got that controller of 5 methods and you're only invoking one of those methods, you still need to inject all 5 responders, because that's what the class has to be able to handle. So then it turns out that it feels very natural after that to make the actions, and if you'll pardon the pun, a first-class player in the pattern. That is, if you, instead of having a class with 5 action methods in it, you have 5 different action classes, each of which receives the request, the particular domain element that it's interacting with, and the responder that it's going to use to send back the response. That's the core of the pattern right there. So you've got individual action classes that take input from the request, they marshal it, send it off to the domain layer responds with some data, the action hands that data off to the responder builds the response, and you're done. That's really all there is to it. We're already doing this in a lot of ways. If you've got a model view controller application, I guarantee that you can look at it, right? If it's well structured, we're not talking about if you've got a controller that's got a bunch of model stuff going on in it. If it's already moderately well structured, you can see very easily how you're going to break it apart and have it conform to action domain responder. And that has the benefit of making things work the way you think they ought to, or rather the way they ought to. What you think is going on, you can make what you're doing actually what's going on, if that makes sense.
Hey, Paul, we had a question come in on the Q&A.
Yeah.
Why would a responder, or why is a responder different than what we used to call a servlet? And is there a substantial difference except splitting the operation into two steps?
So my Java experience is relatively limited. I can't answer that very cleanly. My guess is that servlets. Actually, I don't know enough about servlets to really say whether that's true, whether that's a good comparison or not. I'm sorry to disappoint there. I will expand on that just a little bit and say that if servlets combine the actions or combine the behaviors of interacting with the domain and then building a response themselves, that doesn't really apply to responder per se. The responder is only concerned with building the response. It doesn't interact with the domain. It doesn't receive input from the request. It only takes the information that has been fed to it by the action, and then using the information that's fed to it by the action determines what kind of status it needs to set, what headers it needs to set, and how it needs to present the data that's been given to it. Does that kind of make sense? I'm not trying to avoid the question. I just can't necessarily answer it in terms of a servlet.
I mean, none of us know any better, so we'll just nod and smile and agree, and we'll assume.
All right.
In the interest of marching on to the next bit, and also because I'm aware that Daniel's just been staring at us blathering for a while, I'm going to march on to another question. And Daniel, you mentioned in your introduction that you've been doing a lot of work with kind of SSL, TLS stuff in PHP 5.6. Could you tell us a bit about what's going on there and why it was done? And you're on mute as well, so you want to take that off.
There we go. Victory. You know, when we start talking about the architectural stuff, it just, my eyes glaze over and roll back in my head, and I start looking at the internet, because basically I'm probably, you know, one of, I don't know, maybe 20 people who never ever ever used PHP in the web SAPI environment. Don't ever do it. I live in the CLI. That's the only thing I use it for ever, which is, I know it's weird. And so one of the things that I do in that area is I've been work encryption, and sadly, in previous versions of PHP, the encryption functionality was lacking, at least for the TLS layer, for enabling it on streams, which is what you need when you're sending HTTP data over streams back and forth. And so most people will be familiar with how PHP does things like file get content. So you can just put in an HTTP address and get back a page, and it just magically happens. All you did was give it a string. And that's great, but for every version of PHP prior to 5.6, it was only partially okay, because there are a couple different aspects of an encrypted connection. The first is naturally encrypting that information so that someone who has access to it can't tell what's actually there. But the second part is making sure that the person you're communicating with actually is who they say they are. It doesn't do you any good to send someone encrypted information if the party on the other end isn't able to just decrypt it and read it, and they're not who they're supposed to be, or it's not who you want to send it to. And so for anything before 5.6, anytime you use, say, file get contents, there are a few other functions that also use the SSL stream wrappers. It didn't actually verify who was on the other end, and so it was, if I could get between you and the other party, maybe if I had access to your Wi-Fi network, I could go to a PHP conference and just own everyone there who was using Composer without curl, anything like that. And there were a lot of complaints about it, but it was kind of difficult to implement in a way that didn't break functionality and break the spirit of PHP, where it was just easy to do things. And so what we've done for 5.6 is, one, try to make that work as seamlessly as possible. You shouldn't need to know anything about how encryption works. It should just be as safe as it can possibly be. We've improved the ciphers. We've added much better support for newer versions of the SSL protocols, so that in theory, I mean, if state actors have a quantum computer in a desert or warehouse somewhere, there's not a whole lot we can do. But as far as we know, you don't have to do anything to have the best possible access to protection in your data when you're sending it using TLS now as a 5.6. So in theory, you don't have to do anything, which is the best part about it. So it will just work. So anyway, you guys have questions about how that works, or
I was just generally asking you to talk about it a little. It wasn't a particularly well-formed question. If I remember anything from the changes, as well as kind of adding in this new extra support, it kind of defaults on, right? You've done a very good job of working out how to default enable certain options without them becoming invasive and breaking your applications, but also providing the most logical support for everyone. So can you explain how you did that?
Oh, well, it's relatively simple. When you make a connection to another party, the way that it's verified is through a third party, and that's what's called a certificate authority. And when you buy your SSL certificate, oh, by the way, just in case anybody's confused, the original encryption protocols were SSL. That was the version 2 and 3, which are older. It's now referred to as TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security. So the two terms are basically interchangeable when someone uses them. PHP's when you set it up, you still use SSL for the stream wrappers and everything, so you don't have to. There's not really a difference for our purposes. But basically, you just have to verify that the name on the certificate is. Well, first you have to verify that you trust the certificate authority who issued the certificate. Second, you have to verify then that the name on the certificate is who you're trying to connect with, and there are a few different ways to do that. A few different methodologies, and it just depends on the certificate. But one of the main things that we couldn't do in PHP before 5.6, or that wasn't implemented, was what's called subject alternative name matching, which is where if you buy a certificate, you can put one name on it, but that doesn't help you very much if you have lots of subdomains, things like that. And so the name, you could get a wildcard certificate, but then if you change things, the alternative name gives you a way to have several names on the same certificate without having to pay for a new certificate every time something changes or you add a new subdomain or things like that. And so before 5.6, you couldn't actually connect to this. The prime example is GitHub. GitHub's certificate, the common name on GitHub certificate is just github.com. And so that's great, except for if you need to connect to a subdomain, PHP wouldn't be able to correctly verify it. So if you wanted to pull something down from GitHub using PHP's stream operations, you really had no way of knowing for sure. You could either disable peer verification altogether, or you could just hope that the person on the other end was who they said they were, which is a real problem for something like Composer, because you're downloading code and running it immediately on your machine. So if nefarious parties got in between you and GitHub, it would be real easy to cause problems and inject any kind of code they wanted to on your computer, and you're just going to execute it immediately. So that was one of the major things. I haven't backported it yet to 5.4 and 5.5. But I am going to try to find time to do that very soon, because those are specifically added for things like Composer, very important.
Sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
How big an effort is that backport? Do you see it happening fairly soon, or is it going to be pretty far along?
It's really more an issue. Excuse me, an issue of me finding 5 or 6 hours to do it. I could do it in a weekend, so. It's more of a maybe people hassle me, I'll get around to it. But I would also, I could do a Kickstarter. But that is going to happen. I've meant to do it sooner than now, but we're going to get into 5.4 and 5.5 so that people can take advantage of that without having to upgrade. The other thing I do want to mention, all that stuff is cross-operating system. Windows uses a different certificate store. They don't use a lot of Linux distributions use the OpenSSL formats. Windows has its own thing. It's not any worse or better. It's its own proprietary thing, so they use that. And Chris Wright, who's actually also an internals person, you can find Dave Random. You may have seen him on GitHub or Stack Overflow, things like that. He did the Windows side of things because I don't know anything about that. And so that's one thing to note. Whether you're using Windows, Linux distribution, anything, it should just work. If it doesn't, it's probably our fault. And please submit bug reports. But as far as we know, we've covered as many angles as possible so that everything just works for you.
Sweet. Something you mentioned actually before was about the HTTP server. What was you've been building a HTTP server in PHP, and I've heard it come up a lot because I've heard it's fast as fuck. So what was the reasoning for doing that? Like, why the hell are you making one in PHP?
Well, you mean like besides masochism and OCD? I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Igor's work on React PHP, and I'm not sure It's similar in the theoretical underpinnings to what Node.js does. You basically have any socket communication you make non-blocking, and even though PHP doesn't have threading, when things are non-blocking, you can do other things while you're waiting for socket information, for data to come down the pipe on the socket if it's non-blocking. And basically what you're able to do is say, when data comes, let me know, and I'll be doing other stuff. So it essentially allows you to multiplex, and that's something that we, I know a lot of people would like to build into some of the next majors of PHP because it's extremely useful. But it's similar to that, and it's actually it's interoperable with the React things. So it's not if you can anything you can use with React to be able to do with that. But I started that just because I was into HTTP. I'd done some client work, and I wanted to be able to write my server in PHP because if you've ever spent any time in the PHP community, you've seen people come through begging for help with an Apache rewrite rule, or how to set up their Nginx configuration, or how does this fast CGI thing. And basically, I don't want to write in C. Like, I can write in C. I'm happy to write in C. I don't want to configure my servers for C. I don't want to use plain text. I'm really good with PHP. I like it. I enjoy it. It works for me. I'm very productive. So I want to be able to do things like that in PHP. And so I set out to do that so I could, run a server in PHP. And I could throw benchmark numbers at you, but they're kind of useless without context and things like that. But it's really fast. People would be shocked how fast PHP can be because the socket operations are actually just a very thin layer over the C functionality in the operating system. And so you can, if you eliminate as much overhead as possible, you kind of have to go overboard on avoiding user-land abstractions, but you can make it really fast, and the goal is to hopefully hide all the difficulties so that people can just have a server that runs, fire up a PHP script and have a server that runs. And there are some issues. I know everybody knows about how difficult it is to work around fatal errors and things like that. PHP doesn't expose a lot of access to be able to recover gracefully from things like that. So there are issues with that, but you can, if you want to spend enough time on it, work around them, as I found. So that's how I got into the encryption stuff in the first place, because I needed real encryption to be able to write servers, because otherwise it would just be kind of useless. And because I'm paranoid, so I want to be able to encrypt my own stuff.
Yeah, because fuck the NSA. Although, don't put me on a list, please. I like being in this country. I've only just got back.
Communism last time, and now fuck the NSA. So you're just
waiting for them to cut our connection right now.
Yep, could happen.
I'm interested. How applicable do you guys think things like what level of performance do you think would be necessary for something like that to be broadly useful? Like, if you could say fire up, like, what do you see as the drawbacks there of doing something in PHP, and how performant would it need to be? Like, for you, if something had all the capabilities of like regular web servers, like, do you see that as something that is useful? What questions would you have about something like that?
So the real thing for me would be, I raise my hand, Phil. A real question for me would be how resilient it is versus speed. As long as it was close in speed, you can get by that because Apache's still around. But
right.
It has to be as resilient as Nginx or Apache to be used day to day. Now, specifically, if we're talking about streams and things like that, if they got anywhere close to Node on Nginx, then it would be a very viable alternative. I really like the idea.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I said I really like the idea of like a React, but so far I'd seen from the benchmarks it's just not quite up to par with Node. So unless that's changed recently,
well,
I'd love to take
up to par. Just to clarify, Ben, up to par with what? Because I know it's right up there with speed. Like you can send a shitload of requests at it, but it's just about resilience. You concerned that React starts to fall over because it can't quite handle sustained load, or is there another concern?
So what I saw last time, and I actually talked to Chris Bowden a little bit about it, was once you get to a high number of requests, the speed starts to drop pretty significantly.
Right. Well, that's basically what happens. That was why React is fantastic. It's really great. The abstractions are amazing. It makes what is a somewhat difficult concept to grasp of the non-blocking I/O at first when you're used to doing straight line synchronous things on the WebS API. It makes that really easy. It's fantastic. But the abstractions doing those in userland is what starts to slow it down. That's what I set out to try to do, to do as much of that as close to the native C functionality that's exposed by PHP as possible. And I've been able to, on an i2600 Intel computer, which is quad core, but it acts like 8 cores. So like a pretty standard server machine that you would use if you had one box. I've been able to do 50,000 requests a second with 10,000 simultaneous users. And that's all in a userland, completely userland PHP script. Now, that's the difference with an event-driven server, because you don't have to hold out a thread or a process per request. One individual machine is generally able to handle more simultaneous users at a time. So like if your website blows up on Reddit and you get 1,000 users at the same exact microsecond, in a traditional server, you may have that's how servers crash. They can't handle the simultaneous load. And so what a non-blocking server allows you to do is hold in more clients per machine. And so whether or not that turns out to be more effective for your application depends on the application. If you're doing the kind of thing where you can just cache your responses down the line with something like Varnish in front of it, you don't really need something like that. So if a lot of your content is cacheable or largely static, or you don't have, it's read heavy, then you don't need something like that. But if you're doing like a live application, things like WebSocket chats, where you have, if you wanted to have 1,000 simultaneous connections, that's not the kind of thing you do in a WebS API, because you don't want to have 1,000 threads open or 1,000 processes running and occupied at the same time. So that's the benefit of it. But it can, PHP, the userland is capable of doing those things, and I'm not sure that people realize that. The other common complaint that you, or at least question that you hear from people is, well, PHP extensions aren't safe memory-wise, and they'll leak, in which I have not seen to be the case. There may be some stragglers out there with random extensions where they rely on the process to shut down to clear the memory, but for the most part, I mean, I haven't experienced any of that yet, but that varies from extension to extension. PHP itself, if you can work around its propensity to give you irrecoverable fatal errors, then it's perfectly viable and perfectly fast enough. I've been surprised by how fast it was. So that to me is not an issue at all.
I would argue on the benchmarking front, and I get why you want to do it on real hardware that you control. In order to provide good comparisons, I opine that you might want to do it on an Amazon instance, so that other people have their own, can set up their own, do their own setups and compare their setups to the same kind of instance. That would obviously be more work for you, but it would be, in terms of reliable comparisons, I think it would make whatever case you've got to make would make it stronger. The guys out at Tech, my background is I used to do benchmarking of frameworks, and so I had a whole protocol set up for setting up Amazon stuff. So this kind of thing is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of effort.
Oh yeah. It
and
really is.
There are some guys out at a place called Tech Empower, TECHEMPOWER. Okay, for everyone else, go out and look at their benchmarks. If you can, I would suggest getting your stuff put into part of the comparison series. That will really show off what you're doing.
Right. I mean, I'm not trying to advertise that. What I really want to know. I want people to know that PHP is capable of things like this, and right. I think there's this PHP 4 mentality that people have from several years ago, that PHP is just not a real language and you can't do real programming with it. And people should know that you can. You definitely can, and if you can do it in a performant way. The other thing I do want to mention with that, I want to make a plea to everyone. Please stop using Apache Bench and publishing benchmarks with Apache Bench. They're not applicable to anyone. I know everybody knows this. Do not ever trust benchmarks that you didn't run yourself. They're just not applicable to your situation. They're not applicable to your application. They're not applicable to your hardware. So please stop pushing out benchmarks unless it's something that someone can download with like a Vagrant instance or something and run themselves and see how it compares, because it just doesn't mean anything. Benchmarks are useless.
Preach the word, my brother.
Stop with the benchmarks.
So, Daniel, something I wanted to throw in. You've been reminding me of this article I wrote a while ago. I don't know if you spotted it. It was called Node.js versus PHP benchmarking Codswallop. Just because someone wrote this fucking ridiculous benchmark that was basically Node.js versus PHP, and PHP. Oh my God, look how slow PHP was. And now, yeah, giggling it right now.
Yeah, I am.
But the entire crux of it was Node.js is wonderful and magical and fast, and PHP is slow and shit and old. And the reason for that was that he wrote some script that was basically I'm gonna poll 200 different URLs and then like output the response or something, and then I'm gonna time how long it takes to do all of that. And all that was really tested there was that in Node.js they have a HTTP client which is non-blocking, and PHP he was using file get contents essentially, which was obviously blocking. And what made that what made that benchmark so much drastically worse was that I think he was doing it from the moon. Like the internet connection was so slow that because you're waiting for each single response to come back. The slower your connection, the longer it takes for each response to come back. So the benchmark was basically these 200 requests were made in something like 30 seconds using Node.js versus like fucking 5 minutes with PHP, which was insane. Like how does 200 requests in a row take 5 minutes? But anyway. So I then redid the benchmark myself, and I think I made a vagrant box. I might have just made that up, but the benchmark essentially was if instead of using this file get contents based random piece of code, you used React PHP's async wrapper, and it just kind of bunged it through that wrapper. And by the very end of it, Node.js was doing the same number of requests. It was like 14 seconds for Node.js and like 13 seconds for PHP. It was exactly the same. And the main principle there, just to really quickly finish up, the main principle there is that people don't really understand that the Node.js community are very onto non-blocking code, whereas the PHP community historically hasn't been. So do you face those sort of problems where the code that you try and use is blocking and you have to use different code, or do you wrap it somehow? What do you do?
You would think that you wouldn't be able to do some of these things, but all of PHP's socket code, you can do everything non-blocking, and so it's a non-issue. You can do all of it, and I think there's just a lack of realization because PHP is usually used in a synchronous context where you just have one request and one script, and everything just operates in order. But all these things can be done just fine in PHP, and I mean I have an HTTP client that I can retrieve Google 100 times in a second. Like it's not PHP is capable of all these things, and like it's a misnomer to say that PHP can't do it. It's left over from a previous time when PHP maybe couldn't do it or wasn't.
Yeah.
It's just not true. It's
a bit of a weird thing for us to talk about as well, because I'm sure there'll be people out there on the internet somewhere, especially if this gets posted to Reddit, bitching about how we're trying to use PHP for the wrong thing. But it's kind of a weird that's a weird point of view. It's not that we're desperately trying to use PHP for everything because it's the only language we know. It's more that it's a defense against people wrongly saying that it can't do something. People are saying there's no way PHP can do this, and it can. And that doesn't mean that we're desperately clawing onto it. It means, no, you said a wrong thing, and we're explaining that you're wrong. I face that quite a lot. When I defend PHP, I'm just an idiot that only knows PHP, and they ignore the fact that I've been using Python and Ruby for years. But so one of the main things, I think, is what you mentioned using streams, and you can do asynchronous stuff. You have to work directly with the streams interface, and that can be quite difficult, especially if you compare it to just grabbing data or file get content. So a question to Paul actually would be, with projects like Aura, which we haven't started talking about yet, do you think there's much room where you could add more non-blocking magical goodness into your components, and is that something you've thought about?
So the thing about Aura is that it is primarily a collection of libraries and not a framework in and of itself. Primarily, you can build a framework out of the libraries, but it's not primarily a framework. There are things that you can do to build it into a framework if you wanted to. I can't imagine right now anything that any of the individual libraries would be doing that would benefit from. I don't know if they're that blocking to begin with. I mean, when you make generally you're using like Aura.SQL to make a connection to a database, and then go get some data. That is the sort of thing that would happen.
So, just to interject,
please.
There a sec, because I feel like my question might have been badly formed. If you use something like Tornado in Python, which I've done quite a bit, Tornado is insanely fast, very much the same way that Daniel, your HTTP server is. I'm sure you've probably looked at it for some comparisons. With Tornado, it's basically it's a web framework similar to Flask or Slim or Silex or whatever, and it just runs by itself, and it can asynchronously kind of queue up all the HTTP requests coming in, and then it will process them as soon as it possibly can. And because people that use Tornado, you have to then start using different database packages. So you'd normally have, I can't remember what they're called right now, but there are Python packages that a lot of people use that are very similar to PDO or whatever. If you use those by themselves, then you shoot yourself in the foot, because those happen in a blocking way. So you have all these HTTP requests that are kind of getting stacked up, but then the actual process of the content of the request is blocking, and that kind of fucks the whole thing. So there are a lot of kind of wrappers for these database libraries that allow for, you can make multiple insert requests or make multiple requests in general, and it does those in a non-blocking fashion, so the whole thing's just magically non-blocking and it makes it better. So I'm probably talking a little bit outside my field of knowledge, but I know that lots and lots of non-blocking things make shit fast. So is that like with like things just like the Aura SQL package, is there more non-blocking goodness that can be put into there, is kind of what I'm asking.
So one of the fundamental principles behind Aura is to make each individual library as focused as possible. In fact, the version 1 SQL stuff has actually been broken up in version 2 so that you don't even have a query system in version 2. The reason I bring this up is that if there's going to be non-blocking stuff associated with any particular library, that would be on a library-by-library basis. And then it is my guess that there would be a secondary library, or a secondary bundle, if you will, that would wrap around to the original one that would allow you to queue stuff up and then feed into that, that underlying library. So yeah, I'm sure there's a place for it. If people want to start, if people find a need for it, want to start contributing to that stuff in a way that probably does, my guess is, that probably does not affect the underlying libraries, there's just wrap around it, I'd be totally open to people doing that kind of thing. But again, I don't think it probably does not fit into the libraries as they are now. It sounds like that's the sort of thing that would deserve a sort of a super library or a meta library around the particular one that you wanted to use in a non-blocking scenario. I feel like I rambled a little bit. Does that make sense?
No, that's about right. That's cool.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I do want to add, React has a lot. There's a really good Redis client I know of that I've used for React. That's sort of the rub. If you're going to use a non-blocking server, you can't. I mean, you have to use non-blocking libraries to interface with things like databases. That's something else actually I forgot about that we added for 5.6 was all of the PostgreSQL, which I have no idea how to pronounce that. All of the Postgres. But whatever.
Yeah. We had somebody
all
from
of those operations.
Sorry, I was going to say we had somebody from Postgres on the show a while ago, and they confirmed that it's Postgres. That's
okay. Well, Postgres is fantastic because all of their stuff supports non-blocking things. So that's something new in 5.62. Is all the PGSQL extension functions can now be done in a non-blocking fashion. Now it's not perfect because PHP doesn't have an event loop built in, but it does have everything that you need to be able to put a wrapper around it to make it really easy to use and do non-blocking Postgres things. MySQL is a little tougher because both the old libmysql C libraries that it was originally based on and then the newer MySQL ND doesn't offer any way to connect without blocking, and so you at least have to block to connect, and so that's a little tougher. So something MySQL, you probably can't use that without. I mean, you could if you had a separate extension, or I believe there are some userland libraries out there that actually do the MySQL protocol for you. But that's the rub. You do have to have non-blocking things to use it. But more of those are coming, and I know Julian Pauly has expressed an interest in adding more support for those. So I know I do too, because that's kind of how I want to write applications going forward. So there are people working on non-blocking things as well. So I think more support for that is coming down the pipe. But you do have to have this.
Yeah, it's something I really want to see, because I feel like a lot of kind of packages put it in as a bit of an afterthought. I heard Rasmus talking about, PHP has loads of non-blocking things, and sure, there's the built-in streams interface, which is quite hard to use. There's Postgres, you can do multi-selects or multi-inserts, and curl exec, there's curl multi-exec. There's a few of these things that are kind of a bit gross and hard to work with. And they were all made before we really had the idea of callbacks as well. So in Node.js, obviously, whenever you have these really nice things where you kind of say, do this, and then here's a callback for when you're finished, all of the APIs that were built for this curl multi-exec and shit like that were built before we had callbacks. So you lose a lot of the real benefits of that sort of thing. So I feel like userland code is going to be where we kind of make up that gap for now, and then maybe some fun shit goes into the core and in version 9, whatever we call it. Not to get onto that just yet.
We'll version 15 by then.
No, we're saving 6 or 7 till the end, we promised. So I guess that brings us on to the next topic, guys. And I don't know who wants to take this, but does anyone have any interesting things to say about PSR 7? I guess, Paul, have you been involved? Because I know you're a Fig guy, and so am I. Are you involved with PSR 7 at all?
PSR 7 is the HTTP message PSR?
Yeah, not the hugs. That's 8.
Right. Yeah. So I will confess that I have not been paying as close attention as I should have. I know that Dowling put together a blog post about why there should be pardon me if I butcher this, a stream interface for the body rather than just a string or something like that. The only thing that I have to say on that front is it might be interesting if it was a string or a callable that went into that signature rather than a stream interface per se, so that users would not be locked into adhering to a particular interface, and that implementations could just echo a string or call a callable. That seems to me it would be a relatively straightforward way to solve all the various problems that are associated with it. The trade-off, of course, is that you've got a little bit of if-then logic implementations, but it strikes me as a relatively small kind of trade-off to make. Aside from that, I'm glad to see it progressing. On my to-do list for the beginning of the year this year was to start pushing that particular PSR, and I'm very, very happy that someone else has taken the load on that one.
Yeah, that works out pretty well.
Part of that one, to me.
Carry on. I have nothing useful to say on this.
I think that seems like a gap to me in the I feel like PHP should probably expose a little bit more for people who want to model their HTTP communications as an object, because right now you get the super globals, and that's what you get, and that's your only choice. And I think that we could implement an object representation of that without breaking backwards compatibility. People could still have the super globals if they wanted them, and you would just have access. So that's something I would like to see, and I know it comes up on the list from time to time, but I feel like the PSR is probably necessary. I didn't used to, but I think it is just because we do have that lack. That's something that I think is missing personally in PHP, because we have procedural and object-oriented ways to do pretty much everything. For the most part, we have both for people who want to do it either way, but we don't have both in modeling the HTTP request that comes in. And so I think that it's necessary that PSR, because of that's missing, and maybe that can be used as a lead-in to get something like that into core. Something that is useful for that in PHP 6 as well is the PHP input stream that you use to access the raw entity body of the request that comes in. I don't know, anybody who's dealt with it's probably had to deal with the hassle. It's not seekable or rewindable. You couldn't, like, if you read the body of the message one time, you couldn't, like, you got one shot at it, and then you couldn't be modified after that or read back or anything. But as of 5.6, the input stream that has the entity body in it is seekable, so you can go forwards, backwards, whatever you need to with it. So that's helpful as well.
So while
and will be able to be useful inside the PSR.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're good. I'm done.
I'm with you on modeling the incoming request. That is the super globals as objects. Again, after having written the modernizing book, the super globals are just as bad as any other global that's in the system. having said that, that particular PSR is not necessarily about modeling the incoming, or not, it's not about modeling the execution environment of PHP per se. It's about building requests, and as far as I can tell, building request-style messages or HTTP-style messages to send out and then receive back so that you can decipher them. It's not about modeling the PHP environment. I agree that modeling the PHP environment could be a lot better, but that's not what that PSR is specifically about.
Okay. Cool.
Bollocks! I was chatting with my mute on. Sorry, it's very hot in here, which is why I'm slightly shiny and distracted. Yeah, so I think I disagree with you there, Paul, that the HTTP message isn't particularly about kind of building one and then returning it or anything else. I think it's just about describing a message, and that message could be anywhere. The message could be
Totally
the
cool.
incoming, could be the incoming request. It could be a request you're about to make. It could be a response. It's literally at any point. So if PSR7 was somehow, or something like it, was to ever end up kind of baked into the core, then it would be kind of some weird SAPI level thing where they kind of, the SAPIs interact and they kind of pump the message classes full of data based on however the hell they gather that information from the servers, and then you just have that then available in PHP somewhere, which I think would be quite cool. Daniel, do you think that anything like PSR7 could ever be put into the core? Because I know in Python they keep coming up with PEPs, and they come up with this good idea of this is how you do logging, and then everyone logs like that, and then they just turn that into a language feature in the next version, and then you have a logger built in. We don't do any of that in PHP, and the last time PSR0 was recommended for the core, everyone went, fuck no! Which is probably good, because we've since replaced it with PSR4. But do you ever think that any sort of anything that the fig does would ever become like ratified in the language? And your mute is on as well. We're all doing it.
There we go. I certainly can't speak for other people. I just am, one vote out of a bunch. But I mean, good code is good code, and good APIs are good APIs. The problem is people agreeing on what constitutes this or that, and so I can't really say. All we can do is try to come up with APIs that we think are worth implementing, and then try to put them in place. I mean, internals can be hard to get a consensus on things, and I think that brings up another point: is who are the stewards of the language? Like, who has a say and who should have a say? I think the RFC process that we have is better than a free-for-all. But I do think there could be some improvement. It seems like every time there is an RFC, there's some catastrophe just about, and I think we could find a better way to implement things like that. Maybe bring the community into it more. And I know people talk about that. I think we could improve the process.
I posted a while ago about actually improving. Sorry, I'm gonna you next, Ben. I posted a while ago about how there could be a better workflow for internals. Much like the Fig used to be a fucking free-for-all bit of a shit show, and you could be on day one of a creating a standard, or you could be on day 700 of creating a standard, and you could still be just as close to finishing it as ever, which was a really weird process. So now we have, pre-draft, and then we vote to accept it, and then it's we vote that we actually care about the standard, and then it's in draft, and people work on it, and then we review it, and then we accept it. Right? That standard for us so far seems to be working fairly well. But the trouble with a lot of RFCs seem to be somebody says, hey, I've got this really good idea, and they say, fuck off unless you write some code. So you have to have the code first. But you don't know if they're going to accept it until you've written the code, so that seems like a bit of a weird waste of time. But then even if you do have the code and you do have the idea, you say, hey, I've got this RFC and I've got this code. What do you think? And then like 10 people say yes, and a few other people say no, and people kind of squabble about it, and it kind of goes around in circles. And then people either get bored or they just kind of throw it to a vote and it says no. Like, there doesn't seem to be any sort of trackable logical progress. So it would be very interesting if there was more of a Fig type system where someone could just say, hey, I think it'd be really cool if we could work on getting some sort of PSR7 based thing into the core. Do we have any particular support for that? And then you can kind of vote to have it accepted. once it's been confirmed that that is something that's going to be worked upon, people can either help or piss off.
Yeah. I would like to see the system modified. I mean, it's worked and it's better than nothing, but I think there's a lack of popular community representation, and at the same time, I mean, there are different needs for different groups of people. It's very important to maintain things like backwards compatibility. Like, if you've ever looked at your router, your Wi-Fi router, if you've ever dealt with the interface, it's probably running PHP. Things like that backwards compatibility is really important. And so the needs of someone like me who's like, oh my gosh, I want to have variadics right now. I mean, things like that. There's this interesting interplay between keeping things compatible and fixing WTFs and introducing new features, and I think everybody wants to avoid a Python 3 situation where you change too much, nobody wants to upgrade, or you leave it the same and people keep laughing at the language and say, oh, well, this parameter order should be the other direction, so that means PHP is stupid. You know, things like that. Like, obviously you want to fix, but you got to measure them, and I think that's where a lot of people get confused, but I don't think we have the right process yet, for sure. And I would like to see something more formalized, because it is hard. Even things as simple as, like, if you want to have a voice, you have to go through this weird mailing list registration process that may or may not work, and then you do it, and then if you do that, you get yelled at on the list, then you try to start an RFC, but then you have to get a patch, and you probably need to get someone else to do it, because if you just do it yourself, people are going to look at you sideways. So it's just, there are a lot of obstacles that I think we could make the process easier and more beneficial for everyone, and I would like to see that, and I'd be interested to know firsthand, like, what other people's experiences are. Like, I know people kind of look at internals and think, oh, it's just a bunch of dumb people, but they argue about everything, and I'm trying to stay away from the PHP, the versioning. I'm trying hard to stay away from that, but that's not the case. It's just, you have to understand, people have they're coming from these different places, and it's not just a bunch of people who like to fight with each other and argue, although sometimes I think some people do. I'd be interested, though, to know, like, what other people who, external to the process, are just looking at it, like Paul and Ben, what do you guys see that as, like, what do you see as viable options for changing that? Like, how do you think that could be improved, that process?
So the problem with any process change is that it's the proposal for the process change is going to have to go through the existing process.
Exactly.
There's your first problem right there. And Phil, God love him, managed to get that process change through in the framework interop group. I think that the level of amity in the framework interop group is much higher than it is on PHP internals. So I think that any sort of change that would get affected that is similar to what Phil did in Fig it is my guess that it would meet with much higher resistance from internals, if only because most of the people who are invested in the process are the ones who think the process as it is just fine. So the primary concerns that I see there are political concerns, not technical concerns. Of course, my bias is heading that direction anyway, so it may be that I'm just reiterating all of my priors there. It is, like I said, I think I said this early on, I'm very happy that I'm not involved on the internals list, specifically for the reasons that you've talked about, the vitriol that gets spewed back and forth and the endless discussions. It would be nice to have some sort of it would be nice to have more direction to that process, so that at least the vitriol could be encapsulated in digestible chunks rather than a continuous spewing. But I don't know how to go about doing that. It would take someone with the fortitude and the organizational drive that someone like Phil has, but also the social karma to go along with it. Someone who is well respected on that list by a wide range of a number of people to be able to get the backing to make that kind of process change. I don't know who that would be. So that's a long way of saying I don't know.
It would basically take Rasmus, I think.
Yeah.
It's provided Rasmus is actually, and again, I don't mean to speak for Rasmus. I don't know if he's interested in that or not.
No, I wouldn't.
No, it's totally not.
I mean, the trouble that I've seen a lot recently is that Zeev is kind of taking over as being the main guy. Pretty much any conversation you see that's been a bit crazy, he's going to have been very active in it. And I think, whenever, I don't know, let's just broach the topic of 6 versus 7 now, because we are wrapping up, we are getting towards the end, and we haven't had a huge number of questions in. He's been a massive proponent of 7, and he wrote the RFC saying these are all the arguments why we should use 7. Now, if anyone's seen the RFC, or if you know about this, do we want to call the next major version to follow version 5? Do we want to call it PHP 6 or PHP 7? Now, that seems like a fairly fucking obvious question. But the reasoning is that PHP 6 was a thing. It was never actually released to the public, but there's a lot of emotional ties to it, I suppose, because a lot of people did work very hard on it. Sarah, who we've had on the show before, mentioned, she feels like 6 existed to her because she worked really hard on it. I completely respect that, but it didn't exist to the public, really, apart from a few random books here and there. So the RFC has been, should we call it 6, or should we just skip it and go to 7? Now, the arguments put forward by Zeev, the CTO of Zend, range from the useless to shitty to lunatic. Some of the arguments on there are PHP 6, Perl 6 and MySQL 6 didn't work out very well. It also covers 7 is good luck in many Western countries. And there's so many stupid arguments on there. If you've seen that, I'll put a link in the show notes. Daniel, how do you feel about it? I don't want to do the whole thing.
Well, I mean, I'm on the record as being, I've softened. Like, I don't think it's a big deal, but I don't see any reason. I wasn't around for PHP 6, which kind of became 5.3, and so to me, 6, it was a thing, but it wasn't a release, and so to me, it doesn't make any sense. That said, I think PHP 7 has some awesome marketing potential. Like, I think it could be a really positive thing if we bring out, cool new features, do stuff that people like. I think from a marketing perspective, it could be great, but I don't see any logical reason to skip 6 to go to 7 myself. So, I voted against it, but I'm not broken up. I was a little more turned off by some of the behavior which tends to happen during the voting process. Like, and the RFC to me seemed like it was, hey, we want to do the next one to be 7, so let's just make an RFC so we can do it. And there wasn't really a substance on either side of the argument. The RFC was just kind of fluff, like we have to have an RFC, so let's just put some stuff together, have an RFC, and then we'll vote to make it 7.
Yeah.
So it just seemed like a bit of a sham to me, just doing it to be able to do it because one group wanted it. But I don't care at this point. I'm a little exasperated about it.
I understand the kind of argument that Davey Shafik and Sarah Goldman made was 6 was a real part of the PHP history, and so let's keep it there. It's kind of like this monument to PHP 6. Personally, I don't think that's enough reason. It is weird script version, but I do understand kind of where they're coming from because they, Sarah especially, bled for that release, and it's not necessarily her fault that it didn't happen in the end. So I get that, but as someone who wasn't involved at all, it seems weird for me to skip 6. So personally, 6 is.
I would say that the emotional argument. Well, sorry, that's kind of a patronizing way to call it. The argument that because some people put a lot of work into making it to be a thing and it really existed to them, I would say that that's much more valid than any argument that was put into the RFC. And if that was put into the RFC, then I might have considered it more. Again, just like Daniel, I don't care. I tweeted a little while ago saying, "Dear internals, I don't give a flying fuck which you pick. Just pick one and hurry up." I really don't care. I just don't like. I don't like ridiculous arguments being used. If there's going to be some argument between A and B, and silly arguments are used, then I'm going to complain that silly arguments are being used without personally really caring whether A or B is better, right? So that was kind of the problem for me. And the only argument that PHP 6 really has is that 6 comes after 5. That's also the only argument it actually needs, because 6 does come after 5. So then if you're gonna skip that and you're gonna ignore fucking blatant logic, and you're gonna go to, well, it should be 7, then you have to come up with a really good idea why it should. So it was basically, if you can't prove why we shouldn't do this dumb thing, then we're just gonna go ahead and do the dumb thing. Like, that's not how fucking grown-ups are meant to act. It's like, stop punching yourself in the face. Stop punching yourself in the face. It doesn't make any sense.
So you've got to be real careful about your biases here, and this applies to everybody. This goes back to something that I've been saying for a long time. It's not original to me, and that is smart by itself is overrated. You can talk about, we need a logical argument. We can talk about we need to be rational. But the truth is that people are not primarily rational creatures. They're rationalizing creatures. And this applies to everyone in this debate. I will say right now that my preference, small p, is that we go with PHP 7, because those of us with long memories remember PHP 6 as an actual thing that did exist in some capacity. Now, and again, just to point out, the fact that people are forwarding arguments such as 7 is lucky, these are smart people. These are the people who wrote the freaking language. This is not to heap disdain on them for using those kinds of arguments. This is to point out that when you have something that you want, your rationalizing behaviors go into effect, and you find every possible reason why it makes sense. And the people who are against it find every possible reason why it doesn't make sense, and everyone invokes, well, it's just logical. So again, to completely sideline this, ask Andrzej Zmewski what the next version ought to be. He is the guy who, as far as I know, was really heading the thrust of PHP 6 with the Unicode stuff. And I know that there were tons of other people involved, but he is the one I saw speaking about it. If he thinks it ought to be 6, you know what? Go with 6. If he is still tied to the idea of 6 as his baby, you know what? That is totally cool with me, man. We'll go with 7. The number doesn't matter. Now, again, having said all of that, when writing the history of PHP, which is going to happen in 20 years, those people are going to have to look at this and say, which 6 are we talking about? Are we talking about the 6 that existed before 2014, or are we talking about the 6 that existed after 2014?
Yeah, but so this comes down very much to what's your definition of existing, right? So if it's released,
the 6 that was in common, the common term that was in use at the time.
Yeah.
Because when people were talking about PHP 6 in conversations before 2014, people talking about it in those conversations meant one thing. But after 2014, at some arbitrary date, they meant something else. It might be nice to have a real delineation there.
Yeah.
Having said all that, I don't care.
It's really funny, yeah, because we keep having these discussions and we all admit that we don't care. I think we just all have we all care about the conversation being had properly and quickly, as opposed to dragging on forever like it has been. The reason I'm getting frustrated is that vote got cancelled twice, and people were like removing other people's arguments from the RFC and being fucking children. And that's why
Phil,
I
are you
quite
telling
heated
me
about
you're upset about a vote being canceled twice? Is that what you're saying to me, man?
Hey, PSR 4
Because there's a little pot calling the kettle black here, dude.
Am I the pot or the kettle? I don't know.
I don't know. It depends on which side of the argument you're on.
Yeah. No, it's just a pain. I don't like the way that they were childish about things, and I don't like how the best argument I heard for why 6 should be skipped was stupid web hosts. This is an argument I haven't actually heard before, and it's one of the reasons I continue to post shit on Reddit, apart from when I banned myself for months at a time. Because somebody explained that hosts like 1&1, I think, or somebody else, they actually they had PHP 6 installed on their servers, and you can just select 5.2, 5.3, 6. So now if we released 6, people would click that and think it was 6, and they wouldn't be getting actual 6. So again, I feel like I found some valid arguments since I blogged about how stupid the whole argument was. I've heard some arguments that are great, that maybe should have been put on the RFC instead of, well, in Western culture,
Rationalizing.
Yeah, because to be honest, I've been told that the number 8 is really unlucky in China. So do we just skip 8?
It's super lucky in China. There's
a piss off a billion people.
Yeah. I think there's a Wall Street Journal, or there is a journalist, Jennifer Lee, who has a middle initial of 8 because it's so lucky.
Who knows? So we didn't decide which was correct, which is unfortunate. But we actually, yeah, it's ongoing. Well, luckily the vote's going to end in a week or two, as long as no prick cancels it, because only assholes cancel votes. And that's probably an in-joke for everyone apart from me and Paul and maybe a few other FIG members. But yeah, I think PSR4 was 30 minutes from being accepted, and I got off a plane and had a cider and went, fuck it, cancel it. But there was a bit more thinking to it than that.
I was Johannesburg, where I could not respond to anything and talk you down from the ledge. Man.
Oh dear. So we've had a strange lack of questions today, which is unfortunate. I know for a fact there are 16 of you viewing it. There were 18 earlier, so fuck the 2 that left. But next time, please watch on YouTube or Google+. You can follow us on Twitter. We have IRC channel. We're just desperate for attention. We're just hoping someone loves us and wants to reply to us.
We even have shirts now.
Yeah. Oh no, mine came through. I've got this other one though from Teespring. I just had a post box full of T-shirts that were left. This is PHP and it'll die. I just had a mailbox rammed full of random Teespring T-shirts when I got back to America. So I'm going to spring this on you two. Do you have what we often do at the end of the show is we pimp a product or service or mention something we've been using over the last week or so that we're really excited about. Do you have any link you want to advertise, basically? So Ben, do you have one to go first?
I've been using a browser stack automate lately. So I've used browser stack for a while, and it gives you like every browser you could possibly think of in a virtual environment. So you can click through and try, IE8 on Windows or iOS 6 on iPhone 4, like anything you can think of. But a fairly new thing from them is the Automate platform, so you can integrate it with PHP Unit or Codeception or whatever you happen to be using. And so I had some of our tests for the day job running through Codeception, and then actually run through Automate to test on various browsers and stuff like that. So it's pretty helpful. Pretty cool.
Sorry, I was just reading a funny IRC comment. PHP 7 will make it harder to upgrade because 7 is a prime number and legacy code isn't designed to handle those. Anyway, so that sounds cool. Put that in the show notes. Paul, do you have a product you'd like to pimp? It may or may not be one of your own.
Fair enough. My mercenary heart requires that I pimp MLAPHP.com. That's modernizing legacy applications in PHP. If you've got a spaghetti mess of code, page-oriented, include-oriented, page-based code, you're tearing your eyes out because nothing is separated. It's a horrible mess. It's full of globals. Go buy the book, MLAPHP.com. It will give you step-by-step instructions on how to get everything separated out so that you end up going from a spaghetti mess to something that is auto-loaded, dependency injected, unit tested, layer separated, and front controlled. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be easy. I'm not going to tell you it's going to happen fast. I am going to tell you that you'll be able to do each individual step at your own pace and leave the application running the whole time so that you're not losing any revenue from your application being down. Of course, the other thing I'd like to pimp is Aura. That's AURA, PHP.com. If what you want are fully decoupled, completely independent libraries where if you set it up in Composer to get that particular dependency, that's the only library you get without a ton of other dependencies coming in, then Aura is the thing for you. That's all I've got.
Well, thank you very much. Daniel, do you have a thing?
Yeah. I honestly don't give a fuck if you use any of my code, but if you want to, you can find it on GitHub. I put it there so that I could pull it in with Composer and submodules and stuff easier. But I have been using, one of the things I do is analyze insider trading data from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and all of that is in terrible XML. And I've been using a lib called Fluent DOM by Thomas Weinert. You can find it on GitHub pretty easily, Fluent DOM, and it has just made my life so much easier because I hate XML with as much passion as I could possibly muster. And Fluent DOM has mitigated that significantly. So try out FluentDOM. It's cool.
Sounds good. Mine, I suppose, is actually a little bit of a mini pimp. Is that I'm trying to get the PHP League off the ground a little bit more than it is so far. We've just started up a, I'm just trying to find the link now, like that actually matters at the moment. But we have a Google Groups, so go find the PHP League on the Google Groups. I'm trying to get some fun activity happening in there where we discuss what libraries we're working on, try and get help and advice for each other, and share our tips whilst we're working on our various different fun libraries. So yeah, see if you can find the PHP League on Google Groups. Apart from that, I think that's about the end of it. Ben has a thing. Go. Ben, what's your thing?
I was happy we were finishing.
Oh, you were just waving goodbye. I thought it was an important end note.
Not at all.
Excellent. Well, in that case, guys, thank you very much for sticking around on a Thursday night. And it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.